You won't believe it. Everything changed for Evelyn Harper on a morning that started like any other. Evelyn Harper settled into her favorite chair on the small patio behind her daughter Grace's suburban home. The cool autumn air carried the faint scent of apples and fallen leaves, a bittersweet reminder of the passing seasons. Evelyn clutched her mug of tea, the steam rising like a fragile tether to the warmth she so desperately craved, not just in the cup, but in her life. Follow the whole story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment to let us know where you are watching the video. It motivates us to share more impactful stories. The sounds of Grace's household hummed in the background. The clatter of breakfast dishes, the faint chatter of her grandchildren, and the hurried footsteps of her son-in-law James. Evelyn smiled faintly, though her heart ached. She loved her family deeply, but living with them had begun to feel like overstaying a welcome she wasn't sure was still open. At 74, Evelyn often found herself sitting on the sidelines of their busy lives. Gone were the days of early mornings spent tending to the ranch with Sophia, her late wife, or riding her cherished horse, Lucky, through golden fields. Now, her days blurred into a quiet routine, filled with moments of solitude that no one seemed to notice. She glanced at the letter she'd hidden beneath her knitting bag, the weight of it heavier than the thick paper it was printed on. It was from Golden Horizons, a nearby nursing home. She had reached out to them herself, in secret. "I need to make this easier for Grace," Evelyn whispered to herself, though the words felt like a betrayal of everything she once stood for. Independence had always been her creed, but now it felt like a fading dream. The slam of a car door snapped her from her thoughts. Evelyn turned to see Grace walking briskly toward the house, her face set with determination. She paused, spotting her mother on the patio. "Morning, Mom," Grace called out, her tone cheerful but clipped. Evelyn could see the tension hidden beneath her daughter's smile. "Morning, dear," Evelyn replied, her voice calm but distant. Grace approached, her hands stuffed into her coat pockets. "Hey, can we talk for a bit later? There's something I've been meaning to discuss with you." Evelyn froze, her fingers tightening around her mug. This was it. She'd sensed it coming, the subtle hints, the quiet exchanges between Grace and James when they thought she wasn't paying attention. They'd finally decided it was time for her to leave. "Of course," Evelyn said softly, forcing a smile. Grace hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. But before she could say anything more, James's voice called from inside the house. "Grace, the kids are asking for you." "Coming," Grace shouted back. She gave Evelyn's shoulder a quick squeeze before hurrying inside, leaving her mother alone with her thoughts. Evelyn's heart sank as she stared at the golden leaves scattered across the yard. She had always told herself she'd know when it was time to let go. Now, she wondered if she had misjudged how painful that moment would be. Little did she know, the conversation Grace wanted to have wasn't what Evelyn thought. It wasn't an end. It was a beginning, and everything was about to change. Have you ever felt like the world moved on without you? That's how Evelyn Harper felt as she sat in silence. The letter still sat beneath Evelyn's knitting bag as she returned to her room, its edges peeking out like an unspoken truth. She had spent the last few days reflecting on her life, replaying moments that had shaped her, a habit she hadn't indulged in for years. Her small bedroom, though warm and neatly decorated, felt impersonal. Pictures of her late wife, Sophia, and their early days together were carefully arranged on the dresser. A photo of Lucky, her beloved horse, sat prominently in the center. But the walls carried no echoes of her own touch. It was Grace's house, Grace's world, and Evelyn felt like a guest overstaying her welcome. Sitting at the edge of her bed, she picked up a framed photo of herself and Sophia. It was from their first anniversary, standing arm in arm on the porch of the ranch they had built together. Sophia's smile was radiant, her eyes sparkling with that mix of humor and determination that had first drawn Evelyn to her. "I wish you were here," Evelyn murmured. "You'd know what to do." Her thoughts drifted to the day they had adopted Grace, a wide-eyed 6-year-old with a stubborn streak to rival their own. Grace had been the light of their lives, and Evelyn had promised Sophia she would always be there for her. Now, Evelyn wondered if her presence was doing more harm than good. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her reverie. It was Ms. Collette, her neighbor-turned-friend, carrying a plate of cookies and a knowing smile. "I thought you could use a little company," Miss Collette said, setting the plate on the bedside table. Evelyn chuckled softly. "You always seem to know." "That's what neighbors are for," Miss Collette replied, taking a seat in the armchair by the window. "So, what's on your mind? You've got that faraway look again." Evelyn hesitated, debating how much to reveal. Finally, she said, "I've been thinking about leaving." Miss Collette raised an eyebrow. "Leaving? Where would you go?" Evelyn nodded toward the knitting bag. "Golden Horizons. It's a nice place, close enough for Grace to visit when she has time." Miss Collette pursed her lips. "And you think that's what Grace wants?" "She hasn't said it outright, but I can tell. They're busy, Collette. The kids, their work. This house? I don't want to be a burden." Miss Collette leaned forward, her expression softening. "Evelyn, you're not a burden. You're family. But if you think this is the right move for you, then I'll support you. Just don't jump to conclusions about what Grace wants. Sometimes, we assume the worst when it's really the opposite." Evelyn managed a small smile. "You always know just what to say." "That's my job," Miss Collette said with a wink. As her friend left, Evelyn returned to the photo of Sophia. "Maybe I'm wrong," she whispered, "but maybe this is the best thing I can do for Grace." Outside her window, the wind picked up, scattering the golden leaves like pieces of an unfinished puzzle. Evelyn watched them fall, her heart heavy but resolute. Tomorrow, she would talk to Grace. Tomorrow, she would take the next step. You never realize the weight of silence until it fills a room where words used to live. Evelyn sat at the breakfast table the next morning, the air between her and Grace thick with unspoken tension. Grace bustled around the kitchen, her movements hurried yet precise. She was preparing lunches for the kids while balancing a phone call with her assistant. "Yes, just move the meeting to Thursday." "No, I'll handle the quarterly review myself," Grace said, tucking the phone between her ear and shoulder. She glanced at Evelyn and offered a warm but distracted smile. Evelyn returned the smile, though her mind was elsewhere. The letter to Golden Horizons rested in her cardigan pocket, folded neatly, ready to be mailed. "Mom, do you need anything before I head out?" Grace asked, finally hanging up and turning her full attention to Evelyn. "No, dear," Evelyn replied, her voice calm. "You're busy enough as it is." Grace frowned. "You know you're never a bother, right?" Evelyn nodded but didn't respond. She sipped her tea, hoping the heat would steady her resolve. James entered the kitchen, his easy demeanor a stark contrast to Grace's hurried energy. "Morning, Evelyn." "Morning, love," he said, kissing Grace on the cheek before grabbing a piece of toast. "Morning, James," Evelyn replied. James noticed the slight tension in her voice. "Everything okay?" "Oh, yes," Evelyn said quickly. "Just thinking about a few things." Grace looked at her mother with a mix of concern and curiosity. "What kind of things?" Evelyn hesitated, her fingers tightening around her teacup. "I've been thinking about making things easier for everyone." Grace stopped mid-step, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean by that?" Before Evelyn could answer, the sound of the kids' laughter echoed from the living room. The moment slipped away as Grace hurried to check on them, leaving Evelyn and James alone in the kitchen. James sat across from Evelyn, his expression gentle but probing. "You've been quiet lately. Something on your mind?" Evelyn gave him a small smile. "You're very perceptive, James." "Comes with the job," he said lightly. "But really, if there's something we can do to help, just say the word." Evelyn reached across the table and patted his hand. "You're a good man, James. Grace is lucky to have you." James grinned. "I'm the lucky one." The conversation ended as quickly as it began when Grace returned, ushering the kids toward the car. "We're running late," she said, grabbing her bag. "Mom, we'll talk more tonight, okay?" Evelyn nodded, watching as her daughter and son-in-law wrangled the children out the door. The house grew quiet, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts. She reached into her pocket and unfolded the letter. The words stared back at her, final and unchanging. With a deep breath, she rose from the table and walked to the mailbox at the end of the driveway. As she slipped the letter inside and raised the flag, a part of her felt lighter, as if she'd taken a step towards something she couldn't yet name. But another part of her ached, the the kind of ache that comes from loving too much to stay, or to leave, without pain. The quiet hum of a morning alone was both comforting and haunting, stirring memories Evelyn had kept tucked away. Evelyn sat by the window with her knitting needles, absently working on a scarf that had been in progress for months. Outside, the wind carried leaves across the yard, their soft rustling a stark contrast to the buzz of her thoughts. Her gaze wandered to the old photo album resting on the coffee table. It had been years since she opened it, but something about the day urged her to reach for it. She set her knitting aside and let her fingers trace the worn leather cover. Inside, the pages told a story she could almost hear. Laughter in the way the photos tilted, love in the way hands reached for one another, and resilience in the eyes of the two women who had built a life together. She stopped at a photograph of herself and Sophia on their wedding day, framed by a canopy of oak trees. Evelyn smiled, remembering how the sunlight had danced through the leaves that afternoon, as if the world itself had celebrated their love. "Do you think the world knows what we just did?" Sophia had whispered as they held hands under the old oak. Evelyn had laughed. "The world may not, but we do. And that's enough." Now, staring at the photo, Evelyn felt the pang of loss as fresh as the day Sophia had passed. "You'd know what to do," she murmured, her voice breaking. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She quickly wiped her eyes and stood, surprised to find Miss Colette, her spirited neighbor, peering through the glass pane. "Evelyn, you're decent, aren't you? Open up before I freeze out here." Evelyn chuckled despite herself and opened the door. "Miss Colette, what brings you by so early?" Miss Colette stepped inside, bringing a rush of crisp autumn air with her. "Oh, I was just taking a walk and thought you could use some company. I hate to think of you cooped up here all alone." Evelyn led her to the living room, where Miss Colette immediately zeroed in on the photo album. "Oh, now this is a treasure. Mind if I take a look?" "Not at all," Evelyn said, sitting down as Miss Colette flipped through the pages. "Look at you too," Miss Colette said, pausing on a photo of Evelyn and Sophia at the stables with Lucky, the spirited chestnut horse that had been part of their family for years. "I remember when you used to ride Lucky into town. That horse had more personality than most people." Evelyn smiled wistfully. "He still does. He's living at a stable now. Grace made sure he was taken care of after the fire." Miss Colette glanced up. "And who's taking care of you, Evelyn?" The question hung in the air, heavier than Evelyn had expected. She shrugged. "I'm managing." Miss Collette's sharp eyes softened. "Managing isn't the same as living, my dear." Evelyn didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. Before Miss Colette left, she gave Evelyn a gentle pat on the arm. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Evelyn. But don't mistake strength for stubbornness. Sometimes, letting people help you is the bravest thing you can do." Evelyn watched her neighbor walk down the driveway, her words echoing in her mind. She glanced at the photo album, then at the mailbox where her letter sat waiting to be picked up. That night, as she lay in bed, Evelyn stared at the ceiling, her thoughts a whirlwind of memories and decisions. Miss Colette was right about one thing. She was stubborn, but was her plan to move really about helping Grace? Or was it her way of running from something deeper? Have you ever felt like the world moved on without you? That's how Evelyn Harper felt as she sat in silence. The next morning, Evelyn awoke with a heaviness in her chest that even the crisp autumn sunlight couldn't lift. She had spent most of the night tossing and turning, her thoughts an endless loop of doubt and longing. As she shuffled into the kitchen, she noticed the clock ticking louder than usual, as if it were impatient with her. The letter she had written to Grace sat on the counter, waiting to be mailed. The bold, looping handwriting on the envelope, "Grace Harper," stared back at her like an accusation. Evelyn poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, her hands cradling the warm mug. She thought about Grace, the little girl she and Sophia had fought so hard to adopt. They had wanted to create a family, a legacy of love and acceptance. Grace had been everything they had hoped for and more. Intelligent, determined, with a heart big enough to carry the weight of the world. But now, Grace's life was a whirlwind of deadlines, responsibilities, and the demands of being a mother to two lively boys. Evelyn couldn't blame her for being busy. Grace had her own family to think about, and Evelyn had always prided herself on being independent. But lately, independence had started to feel like isolation. Evelyn sighed and stared out the window, her thoughts drifting back to the years she and Sophia had spent building their life together. She could still hear Sophia's laughter echoing through the house, see her smile as they worked side by side in the garden. Sophia had been the glue that held everything together. "I wish you were here," Evelyn whispered. "You'd know what to do." The sound of the doorbell startled her. Setting her mug down, she made her way to the door and opened it to find Grace standing on the porch, her face flushed from the cold. "Mom," Grace said, smiling as she stepped inside. "I thought I'd drop by before work. I brought you some of those muffins you like." Evelyn's heart ached at the sight of her daughter, her face so full of life and determination. She took the bag of muffins and placed them on the counter, forcing a smile. "Thank you, dear. You didn't have to go out of your way." "It's no trouble," Grace said, her tone light but her eyes scanning the room. "How are you doing?" "Really?" Evelyn hesitated. She wanted to tell Grace everything, to share her fears, her loneliness, her plan to leave. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she said, "I'm fine. Just the usual." Grace frowned slightly but didn't push. "You know you can always call me if you need anything, right?" "I know, sweetheart," Evelyn said, reaching out to pat Grace's hand. "But you've got enough on your plate." Grace opened her mouth to say something but stopped herself. Instead, she hugged Evelyn tightly. "I love you, Mom," she said softly. "I love you too," Evelyn replied, her voice barely above a whisper. After Grace left, Evelyn sat back down at the table, staring at the letter. She felt the weight of her silence pressing down on her. Grace deserved to know how she felt, but Evelyn couldn't bring herself to burden her daughter with her fears. Later that afternoon, the mailman arrived, and Evelyn handed him the letter. As he walked away, she felt a pang of regret but forced herself to let it go. The decision was made, and there was no turning back. Grace Harper sat at her desk, her mind miles away from the spreadsheets open on her computer. Her morning visit with Evelyn had left a weight on her chest she couldn't shake. Something about her mother's smile had seemed off. It wasn't the warm, reassuring smile she'd grown up with. It felt thin, like a curtain barely hiding something deeper. Her phone buzzed, pulling her back to the present. It was James, her husband. "James, hey, the boys are asking what's for dinner. Any ideas?" "Grace, whatever we have in the fridge. I'll figure it out when I get home." She put her phone down and sighed. The balancing act between work, family, and her role as Evelyn's daughter often felt impossible. Just then, her assistant walked in with a bundle of mail. "This came for you, Mrs. Harper." Grace nodded her thanks and set the mail aside. The usual bills and junk, nothing demanding immediate attention. But then she spotted it. An envelope with her mother's handwriting, the bold, familiar loops unmistakable. Curiosity piqued, Grace reached for the letter. Her heart quickened. Evelyn rarely wrote letters. Whatever this was, it had to be important. But before she could open it, her phone buzzed again. This time a work emergency. She set the envelope down, unopened, and grabbed her phone. "This is Grace Harper," she said, slipping into her professional tone. The next hour was a blur of conference calls and emails. By the time Grace looked at the clock, it was almost time to pick up her kids. The letter lay forgotten on the edge of her desk, its edges curling slightly. That evening, Evelyn sat in her armchair, staring at the clock. She wondered if Grace had read the letter yet. Had she been surprised? Upset? Relieved? Evelyn imagined all the possible reactions, each one more nerve-wracking than the last. As the hours ticked by, Evelyn's mind wandered to the memories she had tried to push away. The laughter she and Sophia had shared in this very room. The afternoons spent brushing Lucky's mane under the golden sun. Lucky. Evelyn's heart ached at the thought of her beloved horse. She hadn't visited him in months. Grace had promised to take her, but life had gotten in the way. Would she even get a chance to see him again before she moved? The sound of her phone ringing jolted Evelyn from her thoughts. She reached for it, her heart skipping. Maybe it was Grace, calling after reading the letter. "Hello? Evelyn, it's Ms. Colette," came the familiar voice of her neighbor. "Oh, hi, Colette," Evelyn said, trying to hide her disappointment. I saw Grace leaving this morning and thought I'd check in on you, Colette said. How are you holding up? Evelyn hesitated. Should she tell Colette about her plan? About the letter? But before she could decide, Colette added, You know, Grace is lucky to have a mother like you. She's always been so busy, but you never complain. If it were me, I'd be raising a storm. Evelyn chuckled despite herself. Well, we all have our ways of handling things. After hanging up, Evelyn sat in silence, her thoughts heavier than ever. She glanced at the clock again and realized she was waiting for something. A call, a sign, anything. But the house remained still. That night, as Grace tucked her children into bed, she caught sight of the unopened letter sitting on her nightstand. She reached for it, then paused, exhaustion washing over her. I'll read it in the morning, she whispered to herself, setting it back down. Little did she know, the letter would change everything, for both of them. The morning sunlight poured through the curtains as Grace sat at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee in one hand and the unopened letter in the other. The house was unusually quiet. James had taken the boys out to give her some peace. She set the mug down and ran her finger along the edge of the envelope. Something about the weight of the paper, the deliberate care in her mother's handwriting, made her heart race. Whatever was inside, it wasn't trivial. Finally, she slid a finger under the flap and unfolded the letter. I've thought long and hard about this, and I hope you'll understand. You have given me so much, my dear, a home, a family, and more love than I ever thought I deserved. But I can't shake the feeling that I've become a burden to you. Life has a way of moving forward, and I don't want to be the one holding you back. I've decided to move into Golden Horizons. I know it might come as a shock, but please trust that this is what feels right for me. I've spoken to the staff there, and they seem kind. It's a place where I can be independent again, in my own way. You don't need to worry about me. This isn't goodbye, it's just a new chapter for us both. Thank you, Grace, for everything. For being the light in my life when I thought it had gone out. I love you, more than words can say, with all my heart. Mom. Grace read the letter twice, her hand trembling as she set it down. Her first instinct was denial. This couldn't be real. Her mother, moving to a nursing home? Evelyn, who had always been so fiercely independent, was giving up the home they'd fought to keep after her father passed away? She felt a pang of guilt. Had she made Evelyn feel this way? Had her busy life sent the wrong message? The thought made her chest tighten. James walked in just as Grace pressed the letter to her chest, her eyes welling with tears. What's wrong? He asked, his voice laced with concern. She handed him the letter without a word. As he read, his brow furrowed. Golden Horizons, he said. That's not happening. Grace shook her head, a mix of anger and heartbreak boiling inside her. She thinks she's a burden, James. How did I let her feel like this? James placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. You didn't. She's just Evelyn. She's always trying to protect you, even if it's the wrong way. Grace stood, pacing the kitchen. We have to do something. I can't let her go through with this. She belongs here, with us. James nodded. What's the plan? Grace's eyes narrowed with determination. First, I'm going to talk to her. Then, we're going to finish what we started. That afternoon, Evelyn sat in her armchair, thumbing through an old photo album. She stopped at a picture of herself and Sophia, standing proudly in front of their first house. They'd been so young, so full of dreams. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Evelyn set the album aside and stood, surprised to find Grace on the other side. Grace, what are you doing here? Evelyn asked, stepping aside to let her in. Grace held up the letter. We need to talk about this. Evelyn's face fell. I see you got my letter. I did, Grace said, her voice firm but not unkind. And I don't understand. Why, Mom? Why would you do this without talking to me? Evelyn crossed her arms, her gaze dropping to the floor. I didn't want to burden you, Grace. You have your own life, your own family. I thought this would make things easier for everyone. Grace shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. You're not a burden, Mom. You're my family, and I would never, ever want you to feel like you're anything less than that. Evelyn blinked, surprised by the intensity in her daughter's voice. "But the house, it's too much. And I don't want you to sacrifice your happiness for mine." Grace stepped forward and took her mother's hands. "You've spent your whole life putting me first. Now it's my turn. Please, just trust me." Evelyn hesitated, her resolve wavering. "Grace, what are you planning?" Grace smiled through her tears. "You'll see. Just give me a little time." Grace spent the following days in a whirlwind of activity. She made countless phone calls, coordinated with contractors, and even found herself sneaking around Evelyn's house when her mother wasn't looking. Every part of the plan had to be executed perfectly. There could be no mistakes. This was not just about giving Evelyn a new home. It was about giving her a future that she deserved, one where she wasn't forgotten or left behind. James was her biggest ally, and together, they pulled off the logistical nightmare of arranging for the house to be rebuilt. They'd wanted to restore it after the fire, but they hadn't been able to afford it. Now, with the insurance money finally coming through, it felt like fate was giving them the chance to make everything right. At night, after the boys were asleep, Grace pored over old family photos with James, reliving the memories they were trying to recapture for Evelyn. Sophia had always said that Evelyn's heart belonged to that house, and to Lucky, the horse that had been a part of their family since Grace was a little girl. The thought of Evelyn coming home to it all, in the place that had shaped so many of her happiest moments, filled Grace with hope. But as the days passed, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, a vital piece of the puzzle that she hadn't yet considered. She needed help. The only person who could truly understand what Evelyn needed was Ms. Collette. The next morning, Grace drove over to her neighbor's house, her mind racing with both excitement and apprehension. Miss Collette was a woman of sharp wit and unwavering honesty. If there was anyone who could offer her perspective, it was her. Miss Collette greeted her at the door with her usual no-nonsense smile. "Well, if it isn't the prodigal daughter. What brings you by, Grace?" "I need to talk," Grace said, stepping inside. "About Evelyn, I presume," Miss Collette said with a raised eyebrow. "You're planning something big, aren't you?" Grace nodded, her heart pounding. "How did you know?" Miss Collette poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Grace. "Honey, I've known you and Evelyn for a long time, and you're the only one who can do something this important for her." Grace sipped her coffee, taking a deep breath. "I'm restoring the house. I've got the contractors lined up, but I feel like I'm missing something. I need help understanding what Evelyn truly needs. Not just a house, but something more. I think you might know." Miss Collette thought for a moment, her eyes softening with understanding. What Evelyn needs isn't just walls and windows. She needs a sense of belonging, a feeling that she's not being sent away, that she's being welcomed home. You can rebuild her house, but you've got to rebuild her heart too. Grace's mind began to race as Miss Collette's words sank in. She hadn't considered the emotional part of the puzzle. It wasn't just about the physical space. It was about the emotional connection to that space. She needed to show Evelyn that she was wanted, that she was loved, that nothing had changed except the house's condition. "Lucky," Grace muttered, the realization hitting her like a bolt of lightning. She's going to need Lucky back. The horse. She hasn't seen him since before the fire, dear, Miss Collette finished, her eyes twinkling with the wisdom of someone who had lived through many ups and downs. Lucky was part of Evelyn's soul, Grace. You can't leave that out. Grace felt a sense of urgency that night. She couldn't wait any longer to reveal the plan. The contractors were on schedule, the house was coming together, and now she knew what she had to do. She had to bring Lucky back. The next morning, she called James. "We need to get to the stables. I have a feeling Lucky's been waiting for us just as much as we've been waiting for him." James didn't ask questions. He simply agreed. As Grace and James drove to the nearby stables, Grace felt a wave of nostalgia flood over her. She remembered her mother's soft voice, talking about Lucky as if he were part of their family. "You were always my best friend," Evelyn would say to the horse, laughing as Lucky nuzzled her. When they reached the stables, the stable owner, an old friend of the family, greeted them warmly. "Grace, James, what brings you by?" "We're here to bring Lucky home," Grace said with a grin. The owner's eyes widened with understanding. "It's about time." He led them to the back of the stables where the old horse stood, calm and still, as if he knew he was about to return to the life he once had. Grace's heart swelled as she approached him. "Hey, old friend," she whispered, her hand reaching out to stroke his muzzle. "You ready to go home?" As if on cue, Lucky nuzzled her gently, his eyes soft and kind. And Grace knew without a doubt that this was the missing piece. She was bringing not just a house, but a home, back to her mother. A place where Evelyn could feel that love once again. The day of the reveal approached, and Evelyn's anticipation grew. She knew something was happening. Grace was acting different, and the house seemed to be filled with a kind of energy that hadn't been there for years. But Evelyn was still convinced that she was being sent away. She prepared herself, emotionally bracing for the worst. Then, one morning, Grace arrived early with a car packed full of bags and a silent smile on her face. Evelyn looked up. "What is all this?" Grace simply smiled and said, "Come with me, Mom. You're going to see something." And with that, Evelyn followed her daughter to the car, unaware that her life was about to change forever. The car ride felt unusually long. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her mind swirling with 100 thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment everything changed. Grace hadn't told her where they were going, and the silence in the car only deepened Evelyn's unease. The road seemed to blur by, stretching out like an endless ribbon leading her to some unknown destination. The landscape outside the window was familiar. So much of it reminded her of the early mornings she used to drive with Sophia, their hands intertwined as they'd make their way to town. Back then, there was always laughter in the air, a sense of purpose in every step. Now, it felt like a ghost of the past, one that she couldn't touch, no matter how much she longed to. Evelyn glanced over at Grace, her daughter's eyes focused on the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. She had always been the responsible one, the one who carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, always trying to protect her. But Evelyn couldn't help but wonder, why had Grace been so insistent on this? Why hadn't she just said goodbye and let Evelyn live her final years in peace? "You're awfully quiet today," Evelyn remarked, trying to break the silence. Grace didn't look at her, but her voice was soft, almost comforting. "I'm just thinking, Mom. Thinking about what's next." Evelyn couldn't understand what she meant. She had always tried to be a strong, independent woman, even after Sophia's death. She had taken care of herself. But now, with the decision to move into a nursing home looming, it felt as though Grace was making decisions for her, decisions Evelyn wasn't sure she agreed with. "What do you mean, what's next?" Evelyn asked, her voice tinged with a note of concern. "Grace, I've made up my mind. I'm going to the nursing home, and you don't have to worry about me anymore." Grace's eyes flickered briefly toward Evelyn, a look of sorrow crossing her face before she quickly masked it with a smile. "You're not going anywhere, Mom. We're just going to see something. A surprise, I guess you could say." "A surprise?" Evelyn echoed, her heart beginning to race. "I don't understand. I thought," she trailed off, unsure how to voice the doubt that had been quietly gnawing at her since Grace had started acting strangely. Grace didn't respond immediately, and the silence between them grew heavier. Evelyn stared out the window again, watching the world pass by as they drove deeper into the countryside. The trees grew denser, the houses more spaced out, and Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something important was just around the corner. They turned off the main road onto a narrow, winding path that Evelyn didn't recognize. The road seemed to narrow further with every mile, the trees arching over them like silent witnesses. It felt like they were driving into a world that belonged to a different time. Evelyn's heart thudded in her chest. "Where are we going, Grace?" she asked, her voice now tinged with anxiety. Grace didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pressed a button on the dashboard, and soft music began to play. A familiar tune that Evelyn had once shared with Sophia. It was a song they had both loved, one that Evelyn hadn't heard in years. For a moment, Evelyn felt her breath catch. The memories came flooding back, the days spent tending to the garden, laughing at something silly Sophia had said, the warmth of their shared life. She closed her eyes for a moment, just letting the music take her, and when she opened them again, the car had slowed to a stop. Evelyn looked out the window, her breath catching in her throat as the sight before her hit her like a wave. There, in front of her, stood the house. Their house. The house that had burned to the ground. But now, it was restored. It stood tall and proud, its familiar shape now gleaming in the sunlight, as if nothing had ever happened. The chimney, the porch swing, the windows that had once been cracked and charred. Everything was as it had been. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she turned toward Grace, unable to speak. "Grace, how?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Grace looked at her, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "We did it, Mom. We rebuilt it. Everything you loved is back." Evelyn stepped out of the car slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. She could hardly believe it. She reached out, touching the porch railing as though she were afraid it might disappear if she didn't hold on tight. It felt real. This was real. She turned to Grace, her hands shaking as she clasped her daughter's hands. "You did this for me?" Grace nodded, her smile wide with emotion. "I wanted you to come home, Mom. This is where you belong. You don't have to go anywhere." Evelyn couldn't find the words. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at the house, the memories flooding back all at once. This house had been the heart of her life with Sophia. It had been where Grace had grown up, where laughter had echoed through the rooms, where love had lived and thrived. And now, it was waiting for her. Before Evelyn could say anything more, a soft nicker caught her attention. She turned quickly, and there, standing in the open barn door, was Lucky. Her heart stopped. The horse, old now, but still strong and gentle, stood watching her with those familiar eyes. Evelyn felt the floodgates of emotion break open. She ran toward him, her heart racing, her feet not quite able to keep up with the joy that surged through her. "Lucky!" she cried, her voice breaking. She reached out and wrapped her arms around his neck, her tears falling freely as she buried her face in his soft mane. "You came back. You're here." Grace stood behind her, watching quietly, giving her space. Evelyn looked over at her daughter, her heart full. "You didn't just bring me back to a house, Grace," she said softly. "You brought me back to my life. You gave me everything." Grace smiled, tears glistening in her own eyes. "I wanted you to know, Mom, that you're not just my mother. You're everything to me, and you deserve to be home." Evelyn held on to Lucky, the weight of her emotions overwhelming her. She had come here to say goodbye, to give up, but Grace had brought her back to a life she had thought was lost forever. And in that moment, Evelyn knew she was home. Evelyn stood there, the smell of hay and fresh wood filling the air as she held on to Lucky, the one constant in her life, the one link to the past that had never let her down. The house, the barn, and everything around her felt like a dream. She had never expected to see it again. Not like this. It was as if the years of loss had been erased in a single moment. The time she had spent worrying, the anxiety of feeling like a burden, the loneliness of thinking she had no place left. All of it melted away in the warmth of the place she had once called home. Grace stood by the porch, watching her mother with quiet tenderness. She had never been able to fully express how much she had wanted to make this right, to give Evelyn back the life she deserved. It hadn't been easy, finding the right contractors, dealing with the insurance, taking the emotional toll of seeing the house in ruins, but it had all been worth it to see her mother's face light up like this. Evelyn finally pulled away from Lucky and wiped her tears, her heart still racing. She took a deep breath, her gaze lifting from the horse to Grace, who was now standing on the porch, waiting for her to join her. "I don't know what to say, Grace," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know you were doing this. I thought I was leaving for good." Grace smiled softly, stepping forward. "I couldn't let you leave like that. You're not a burden, Mom. You're my mother. And I wanted you to have something that was yours, that was ours, something to hold on to." Evelyn walked toward her daughter, her feet moving slowly, as if she were afraid that if she moved too quickly, the dream might disappear. When she reached Grace, she stopped and looked at her, seeing not just the woman her daughter had become, but the little girl who had once run around this house, laughing and full of life. "I don't deserve this, Grace," Evelyn said quietly. "I don't deserve all of this." Grace reached out and took her mother's hands, squeezing them gently. You deserve every bit of it, Mom. You've given so much to me and to this family. You're the heart of it, and this is where you belong." Evelyn felt her heart swell with gratitude. She had spent so many years thinking that her life had come to a close, that her time had passed. But in this moment, she realized that the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. "You know," Evelyn said, turning to look at the barn again, "when Sophia and I built this place, we never imagined it would come to this. We never thought we'd have to rebuild it from the ashes." "Life has a way of surprising us," Grace said, her voice warm with understanding. "But it also has a way of bringing us back to what really matters." Evelyn nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the years in her bones, but also a new lightness in her heart. She had lost so much over the years. Sophia, the house, pieces of herself along the way. But she was beginning to see that loss didn't mean an end. It was just part of the journey. And this new chapter, this new beginning, was something she would embrace with all her heart. As Evelyn stood there, her hands still clasped in Grace's, she could hear the faint sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the distant call of a bird. Everything was quiet for a moment, just the two of them standing there, in the middle of what felt like a new life. And yet, it was still so familiar, like stepping into a pair of shoes that had been waiting for her all along. "We'll fix it up," Evelyn said with a soft smile, her eyes lighting up as she took in the house once more. "Make it ours again. I've got the energy for it. I'll need to get to work, but I think I can manage." Grace laughed, the sound full of love and relief. "I'm sure you can, Mom. You've always managed." For the first time in a long while, Evelyn didn't feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. She didn't feel like she was holding others back. She felt free. The house, the land, the people she loved, they were all part of her journey. They always had been. And now, she was where she belonged. Evelyn walked over to the barn, reaching out to touch the weathered wood of the door, her fingers brushing against the grain. She stood there for a moment, breathing in the familiar scent of the barn and listening to the rustling of the trees. Everything about this place spoke to her, of memories, of love, of time past and time to come. And as she stood there, taking it all in, she realized that this was the gift that Grace had given her. Not just a house, not just a restoration of what was lost, but the chance to rediscover herself, to find a new way forward, with the past and the future intertwined. Lucky nickered again, and Evelyn turned to see him watching her patiently. She smiled, her heart full. "I think we're going to be just fine, old friend," she said softly to him, reaching out to stroke his mane once more. Grace joined her by the barn, standing quietly beside her. "I'm glad you're here, Mom," she said, her voice tender. "I'm glad too," Evelyn replied, her heart light. "You've given me the greatest gift of all." The two women stood there in silence for a while, the only sounds the gentle breeze and the soft steps of Lucky as he wandered nearby. It was a moment of peace, of understanding, of coming home. And for Evelyn, this was just the beginning. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting soft beams of light across the restored barn. The crisp air, full of the earthy scent of wood and fresh grass, filled Evelyn's lungs as she stepped outside to the porch, where Grace had set up a small table with tea and scones. It had become their new morning ritual, sitting together, sipping tea, and watching the sun rise over the land that had once been their home. Evelyn had never imagined that she would find peace like this again. The house, the barn, the pasture, all had been restored, and yet it felt like more than just a physical renewal. It was as though the love she had once shared with Sophia was woven into every corner of the property, and in the presence of her daughter, that love had come alive again. Grace had been by her side every step of the way, not just with the physical work of rebuilding, but with the emotional support Evelyn hadn't known she needed. It was clear that her daughter had grown in ways Evelyn hadn't fully understood before. Grace wasn't just a caregiver anymore. She was a woman who had forged her own path, balanced her family, and yet still found a way to make Evelyn's well-being her priority. Evelyn smiled as she sat down at the table, her hand resting on her cup of tea. "You've done so much for me, Grace," she said softly, her voice full of gratitude. "I don't think I'll ever be able to express how much this means to me." Grace sat across from her, taking a sip of tea. "You don't need to say anything, Mom," she replied with a gentle smile. "I just wanted you to feel like this was still your home. Because it is. It always has been." For a moment, Evelyn let the silence settle between them, savoring the peace. There were still days ahead filled with work, challenges, and the occasional doubt. But right now, in this moment, everything felt perfect. The old, familiar rhythm of life was returning, and Evelyn felt more alive than she had in years. "I never thought I would be here again," Evelyn mused, her gaze sweeping across the yard. "I thought I was done with this place, with the memories, but it turns out there's still so much to give and to receive." Grace reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "You don't have to leave anything behind, Mom. We're not erasing the past. We're just making room for more." Evelyn squeezed Grace's hand in return, her heart swelling. She had lived with so much guilt, thinking she was a burden, thinking that she had overstayed her welcome in her daughter's life. But now, with this new beginning, she realized that they were both evolving together in a way that was better than she ever could have imagined. "Have you talked to Ms. Collette lately?" Grace asked, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "I bet she's been giving you all sorts of advice about what you should do next." Evelyn chuckled softly. "Oh, Miss Collette has been as outspoken as ever. She still says I'm too young to be slowing down, that I should be out riding more." Grace laughed, her eyes twinkling. "I bet she's right. You know, I think I see a little bit of her in you. She always had such a way of taking life by the horns." Evelyn thought of her old neighbor with fondness. Miss Collette had been a fixture in their lives for years, offering unsolicited yet well-meaning advice, a sharp wit, and an undeniable love for the Harper family. She was a reminder that no matter how much time passed, there were still people who believed in Evelyn, who remembered the woman she had been long before the world started to feel smaller. "I think you're right," Evelyn said with a smile. "Maybe it's time for me to stop holding back. Life doesn't stop for anyone, does it?" Grace shook her head. "Nope, it keeps moving forward. And so do we." With a renewed sense of purpose, Evelyn finished her tea, feeling a sense of clarity settle over her. There was work to be done, repairs to be finished, the garden to plant, Lucky to ride. But more than that, there were memories to be made. She had spent too much time worrying about what was behind her, when what mattered was what lay ahead. After finishing their tea, they stood up, and Evelyn followed Grace into the barn, where the tools were neatly organized, waiting for the next project. Grace had always been a worker, just like her, and Evelyn felt a sense of pride in how she had grown into such a capable, loving woman. As they approached the barn doors, Evelyn turned to her daughter. "You know, I think I want to try riding again. What do you think?" Grace smiled. "I think you should. I think you've earned it." And with that, Evelyn knew that the days ahead would be filled with challenges, but also with moments of beauty and joy. The road wouldn't always be smooth, but she was no longer afraid of the bumps along the way. She had her daughter by her side, her memories to guide her, and a future filled with possibility. The morning was cool, the air crisp, with the promise of change hanging in the atmosphere. Evelyn stood by the barn, watching Grace as she adjusted the reins on Lucky, her mother's faithful horse. The barn doors creaked as the wind moved them slightly, and Evelyn caught herself thinking that there was something deeply symbolic about the old wood shifting in the breeze. Like everything around her was finally starting to breathe again. "Ready for a little adventure, Mom?" Grace called out from where she was securing the last bit of the tack. Evelyn's heart fluttered in her chest. She had no idea what Grace was planning, but there was a sense of excitement that was hard to ignore. It felt like the world was moving in a different rhythm now, as if time itself had been reset with the house and barn. The weight she had carried for so long was lifting, but there were still traces of doubt lingering in the back of her mind. Was she really ready to step back into the world? Into her life? "I suppose so," Evelyn replied, her voice filled with both anticipation and unease. She hadn't ridden in years, ever since the accident that had left her with a sore back and more than a little fear. But now, with Lucky standing so strong and steady in front of her, it felt like she was being called back to something deeper. Grace gave her a reassuring smile and helped her up onto the saddle. "You'll be fine, Mom. Just trust yourself." Evelyn's hands gripped the reins, and as Lucky started to walk with steady steps, she couldn't help but feel the pull of something she had long forgotten. It wasn't just the motion of the horse beneath her. It was the freedom, the wind against her face, the soft clopping of the hooves, the way the world seemed to narrow down to a single point of focus, just her and the horse, moving forward. As they rode along the familiar paths that Evelyn had once walked with Sophia, memories flooded back. She remembered the quiet afternoons when she and Sophia had taken Lucky out, chatting about the future, laughing at little things, and feeling like they had all the time in the world. Back then, everything had seemed so certain, but now, time felt fragile, like sand slipping through her fingers. Evelyn exhaled slowly, feeling a rush of emotion wash over her. It was as if she was reconnecting with a version of herself that had been tucked away for too long. Grace, riding beside her, looked over and smiled knowingly. She had seen this moment coming, Evelyn realized. Her daughter had given her the space to rediscover the life she had once loved, had once lived with such joy. "This is nice," Evelyn said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "I had forgotten how peaceful it is out here." Grace nodded. "I thought you might. This land is part of you, Mom. It always has been." They rode for a while in silence, the only sounds being the rhythm of Lucky's hooves and the occasional birdsong. The morning sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the dirt path. When they reached the old creek, Evelyn dismounted carefully, taking a moment to stretch her legs. She stood at the water's edge for a few moments, letting the quiet beauty of the place seep into her bones. There was something about the creek that always had a way of grounding her, of reminding her that life wasn't about grand gestures. It was about the small, simple moments that made up each day. "Mom, there's something I've been meaning to tell you," Grace said, her voice hesitant but steady. Evelyn turned toward her daughter, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it, Grace?" I've been planning something," Grace began. "I wanted to surprise you. I know you thought we were just fixing up the barn and house, but there's more to it than that. It's something I've been working on for a while." Evelyn's brow furrowed, her mind racing. "What do you mean?" Grace stepped closer, her eyes filled with both excitement and uncertainty. "Mom, we're not just restoring the property. We're restoring your life, your future. I want you to stay here, not as a guest, but as my partner. I want to build something new here with you. For you. A place where we can both live, together, without all the pressures and worries that we've had in the past." Evelyn felt a surge of emotion rise in her chest, gratitude, confusion, and overwhelming love for the daughter who had so selflessly worked to give her back everything she thought she had lost. "Grace, I don't know what to say." Grace smiled gently. "You don't need to say anything right now, Mom. I just wanted you to know that this place, this life we're building, it's for both of us. We're not going anywhere. We're staying here together." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of relief, of understanding. She had spent so much time thinking she was a burden, that she didn't belong. But in this moment, surrounded by the beauty of the land she had once loved, she realized how wrong she had been. "I never thought I would have this again," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought I was too old for a second chance." Grace shook her head. "It's never too late, Mom. You've still got so much to give. And I'm not going anywhere." Evelyn felt her heart swell as she looked out over the creek, the future stretching before her like an open road. There was no more fear, no more doubt. She had a family, a daughter who loved her, and a place that would always be home. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start living again. The car ride was quiet, the only sound coming from the soft hum of the engine as they drove away from the house. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had always hated these moments, the ones where she felt like something was slipping away, even when she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. But today, there was an unsettling weight in her chest, something that hadn't been there before. Grace sat beside her, her eyes on the road, a gentle smile playing at the corners of her lips. James, driving, kept his gaze focused ahead, but there was a warmth in his eyes whenever he glanced toward Evelyn. His silent support made her feel both comforted and more than a little unsure. What was this surprise, and why did it feel like she was heading towards something she wasn't prepared for? Evelyn looked out the window, watching the familiar landscape roll past. The fields, the old farmhouse down the road where she had once helped a neighbor with her garden, the grove of trees where she and Sophia had shared quiet moments. Everything felt too close, too known. And yet, there was something different about it all today. Something that made the world feel both large and too small, like she was on the brink of stepping into a new version of her life. As the car turned onto a different road, one she didn't recognize, Evelyn's anxiety grew. It wasn't just the uncertainty of the surprise that made her uneasy. It was the feeling that she was being led somewhere, away from her home, away from what she had known for so many years. She swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump in her throat. "Grace, where are we going?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace glanced at her quickly, then back at the road. "Mom, I promise you're going to love this. We're just taking a little detour." Evelyn's brow furrowed. A detour? Was it really just a detour? Or was she being taken somewhere else? A place she wasn't ready for? As the car wound through the unfamiliar countryside, Evelyn's mind wandered back to the conversations she'd had with Ms. Colette over the past few weeks. The older woman had been a regular visitor, always with a wry smile and a sharp tongue. She had joked more than once that Grace was planning to send Evelyn to a nursing home. At the time, Evelyn had laughed along, trying to dismiss the thought, but now the words haunted her. Could it be true? Was this the moment she had been dreading? A sudden sense of dread washed over her, and she turned toward Grace, her face filled with worry. "Grace, is this about the nursing home?" Grace's grip on the steering wheel tightened for a brief moment before she turned to meet her mother's eyes. "No, Mom. I told you, I'm not sending you away. I'm bringing you back home. And this surprise, it's for you. To show you that we're not leaving you behind." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. A weight settled in her stomach, but there was something in Grace's voice, something that softened the sharp edges of her fear. Maybe she wasn't being cast aside. After all, James glanced in the rearview mirror. "You'll see soon enough, Evelyn. Just trust us." Evelyn nodded slowly, still uncertain, but trying to take comfort in their words. She had spent so many years second-guessing herself, wondering if she was truly wanted, if she was really needed. Now, though, as the landscape shifted around her, she realized that her fear had been more about what she thought she deserved than what was actually waiting for her. As the car continued down the winding road, the trees grew thicker, their shadows stretching across the road like the hands of time, reaching out to pull her into the unknown. And then, just as Evelyn was about to speak again, the car slowed and turned onto a small dirt road. A moment later, they reached the edge of a familiar hill. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. There, standing in the distance, was the old farmhouse, the one she and Sophia had once called their own. But now, it looked different. It was more than just the fresh coat of paint on the walls, the new roof that gleamed in the sunlight. It was the land itself, the garden they had once dreamed of planting, now blooming with life. The barn, too, was standing proud and tall, as if it had never fallen into disrepair. Evelyn's heart raced, her chest tightening as she realized what was happening. It's our home," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But how?" Grace turned to her, her face filled with pride. "It's yours, Mom. We restored it. We rebuilt it, just the way it was, but better. This is where you belong." Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes as she looked at the place that had once been her sanctuary, the place where she had shared her life with Sophia. The idea of losing it, of letting it slip away, had filled her with more grief than she could bear. But now, standing here, she realized that everything she had thought was lost was still within reach. The car came to a stop, and James got out, walking around to open the door for Evelyn. As she stepped out of the car, the familiar smells of the land, the earth, the hay, the trees, filled her senses. She felt as though she were stepping back in time, to a version of herself she thought she had left behind. Grace and James stood by her, waiting as Evelyn slowly approached the house. Her heart swelled with gratitude, disbelief, and love. This was more than a surprise. This was a second chance, a way back to herself. "This is your home, Mom," Grace said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "Always has been. Always will be." Evelyn wiped away a tear, her heart full to bursting. She had come here once, lost and uncertain, but now she was ready to rediscover the life that had always been hers, the one she had almost given up on. And as she stood there, her feet firmly planted in the soil of her past and future, she realized that the road ahead wasn't about moving on. It was about returning home. Evelyn stood at the threshold of the house, her hand resting lightly on the weathered doorframe. The sunlight streamed through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the front porch, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so many years. Everything about this place was familiar, yet strangely new, like a dream she'd once had but had nearly forgotten. Grace and James were standing a few steps behind her, watching her closely, waiting for her to take it all in. Evelyn turned slowly, her eyes scanning the restored house, the land, the barn, all of it. It was as though time had been kind, erasing the scars of abandonment and neglect, and replacing them with something whole, something worthy of a second chance. "Is it really?" Evelyn's voice trembled as she tried to find the words. Grace stepped forward, her smile wide and full of love. "Yes, Mom. It's really yours. We wanted you to have it back, to have everything you've loved, the way it was. We've taken care of everything." Evelyn took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This was her home. But was it still her home after everything that had happened? The years without Sophia, the empty rooms that had once been filled with laughter and love? Could it truly be home again? Before Evelyn could say anything else, a soft whinny broke through the quiet air. Her heart skipped a beat, and she turned toward the barn. There, standing in the doorway, was Lucky, the old horse that had been with her and Sophia for as long as she could remember. He was older now, his coat graying, but his presence was as strong and comforting as ever. "Lucky," Evelyn whispered, her eyes filling with tears. Without another word, she moved toward him, her legs unsteady but determined. When she reached him, Lucky nuzzled her gently, his familiar scent filling her senses. Evelyn placed a hand on his mane, feeling the warmth of his body beneath her fingers. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply stand there, soaking in the peace that surrounded her. It was as though everything in her life, the love, the loss, the heartache, had led her to this moment, this place. Grace and James stood back, watching the reunion quietly. James had already seen how important Lucky was to Evelyn, how deeply connected she was to the horse. He had been part of their life when Sophia was still alive, and he had witnessed the way Evelyn would talk to him, as if he were a living memory of her late wife. It was clear that Lucky wasn't just a horse to Evelyn. He was a piece of her heart, a reminder of the love she had shared with Sophia. "Do you want to go for a ride?" Grace asked gently, her voice full of understanding. Evelyn nodded, her throat tight. "I'd like that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace moved to the barn to fetch the saddle, but Evelyn remained with Lucky, rubbing his coat softly. It felt right to be here, with him, on this land that had once been so full of life. She could almost hear Sophia's laughter in the wind, see her standing beside the fence, calling to Lucky as they prepared for another ride. It was all coming back to her. The simple joys, the love, the hope. For so long, she had feared that the best years of her life were behind her, that the memories of Sophia would fade, that the house would crumble, that Lucky would be lost to time. But standing here, feeling the warmth of the sun and the solid ground beneath her feet, she realized that those fears had been unfounded. This was still her life, her home, and it wasn't over. Grace returned with the saddle, and together, the three of them carefully prepared Lucky for a ride. Evelyn's hands shook as she adjusted the saddle, but there was a calmness in her movements, an old rhythm that she had almost forgotten. When she was ready, she gently placed her foot in the stirrup and swung herself onto Lucky's back. For a moment, she felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the joy of being in control of something so strong and free. "Let's go," Evelyn said softly, her voice steady now. Grace and James smiled as they watched her ride off toward the horizon. They knew that this wasn't just a physical journey, it was an emotional one. Evelyn was rediscovering herself, her place in the world, and the love that had always been there, even when it felt lost. As Evelyn rode across the open fields, the wind tugging at her hair and the sun warming her skin, she felt alive again. It wasn't just the land, or the house, or even Lucky. It was the memories, the love, the sense of belonging that she had almost lost, but that she was now reclaiming. She had thought she was past her prime, that the world had moved on without her. But as she rode, the world seemed to open up before her. There was still time, still love, still a future worth living. When she turned the horse around and began to ride back toward the house, Evelyn felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The past was not something to be mourned or feared. It was something to honor, to carry forward with grace. The evening air was crisp as Evelyn sat on the porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the last rays of the sun disappear over the horizon. Lucky grazed peacefully in the field nearby, his gentle movements almost rhythmic in the quiet evening. Grace and James had gone inside to prepare dinner, giving Evelyn some time alone with her thoughts. As she watched the landscape she had known for so many years, it felt as though time itself had slowed, offering her a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. The house, the land, had once been a place of love and life, and now it was hers again. After so many years of being adrift, of feeling like a guest in her own life, Evelyn had finally come home. She thought of Sophia, the love of her life, how they had dreamed of growing old together here, watching their family grow. But Sophia was gone, taken too soon, leaving a void that Evelyn had carried with her all these years. It was only now, standing on the porch in the quiet of the evening, that she realized something crucial. She had spent so much time mourning what was lost, she had almost forgotten to live for what was still here. The sound of the door opening behind her broke her reverie. Grace stepped out, a warm smile on her face. "Dinner's ready, Mom. We're having your favorite beef stew," she said, her voice soft but full of warmth. Evelyn smiled and patted the empty chair beside her. "I'll be in a minute. I just want to take in this moment. It feels different now, like I'm seeing everything with new eyes." Grace nodded and took a seat beside her. There was a tenderness in her gaze, one that spoke of both understanding and concern. "I know it's been hard, Mom, losing Dad, and then feeling like you had to leave everything behind. But you don't have to do that anymore. You have us. You have this place. And most importantly, you have a future." Evelyn turned to look at her daughter, her heart swelling with emotion. Grace had always been strong, independent, but seeing her here now, so grown and so capable, filled Evelyn with a sense of pride. Grace had her own family, her own life, yet she had still found time to bring Evelyn back to this place, to rebuild it, to rebuild Evelyn's life. "I know," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's just hard to believe sometimes. I've spent so many years feeling like a shadow of the person I used to be. I didn't know if I could find my way back." "You don't have to find your way back," Grace said softly, taking her mother's hand. "You're already here. You're home. And we're all here with you." For the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt the weight of the past lighten. There would always be sorrow, always be memories that were bittersweet. But there was also love, still blooming, still waiting for her to embrace it. It wasn't too late. It would never be too late. The two women sat in companionable silence as the stars began to twinkle above them, a gentle reminder that the night was just as full of possibility as the day. Evelyn had spent so long feeling like she was on the edge of something, waiting for a sign, for a reason to keep going. But now, as she looked at the land around her, the house that had been brought back to life, and the family she had raised, she realized she had already been given that sign. It had been there all along. She wasn't alone. The future was wide open, and Evelyn felt a spark of hope she hadn't felt in years. The car was silent except for the low hum of the engine as it rolled down the winding road that led away from the house. Evelyn sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the familiar landscape, though it seemed different now, as if a veil had been lifted. The setting sun cast long shadows across the fields, and the trees seemed to reach toward the sky as if they too were stretching out for something new. She felt a tight knot in her stomach as she glanced at Grace and James in the front seat, their faces set in expressions that Evelyn couldn't quite read. Her mind churned with the thoughts that had taken root over the past few days, each one more troubling than the last. This is it. I'm being sent away. The words had lodged in her brain like a splinter she couldn't remove. She had tried to ignore them, tried to tell herself that Grace and James wouldn't do something so harsh. But the more she thought about the packing, the moving boxes, the quiet conversations behind closed doors, the more convinced she became. It was the only explanation that made sense. She had become a burden, and now it was time to leave. The thought hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't as though she hadn't seen it coming. Grace had her own life, her own family to care for. And Evelyn was, after all, getting older. She had seen the way her daughter's patience had worn thin over the past few months, the subtle tension in her voice when they spoke about things like the future or what came next. She couldn't help but feel like a shadow in Grace's life, a weight on her shoulders that she no longer wanted to bear. But being sent away, that felt different. That felt like being abandoned. Evelyn knew the practical reasons for it, but the emotional toll was something else entirely. She could feel her heart sinking as the car turned down a narrow road, lined with tall fences and old houses that looked like they had been there for centuries. She knew this road well. It was the way to the nursing home. Her stomach turned. The thought of a sterile room, of strangers' faces, and the clatter of a place designed to house the elderly made her stomach turn. It was supposed to be a place of peace, a place to rest, but to Evelyn, it felt like a death sentence. But maybe this is what I deserve, she thought bitterly. Maybe this is the end of my story. As the car continued its journey, Evelyn's thoughts drifted back to her younger days. She remembered when she and Sophia had talked about their future, about growing old together in this house. They had made plans to travel, to spend their days sitting in rocking chairs on the porch, watching the world go by. But those dreams were just that, dreams. Sophia was gone, and Evelyn was left with nothing but memories and the realization that she had been living in the past for far too long. The car slowed as it approached the nursing home, its imposing gates coming into view. A dull ache spread across Evelyn's chest. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready to let go of everything, of her home, her life, her memories. Grace pulled into the parking lot, her hands steady on the wheel. Evelyn watched as she parked the car, her mind spinning with confusion and dread. She couldn't do this. She didn't want to be here. But as the engine cut off and the car fell silent, she knew there was no turning back. Grace turned around, her eyes soft with an emotion Evelyn couldn't place. "We're here, Mom. Just a minute, and then you can see it." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. See what? Before she could ask, Grace opened her door and stepped out, followed by James. Evelyn hesitated for a long moment before pushing open her own door and stepping into the cool evening air. The silence was heavy as they led her through the gates of the nursing home, and Evelyn's mind was filled with a cold certainty. This is where it ends. But as they turned the corner, something unexpected happened. Evelyn froze. Standing before her was not the sterile, lifeless building she had expected, but her own home, the one she had thought was lost forever. It was restored, its walls freshly painted, the windows gleaming in the fading sunlight. It looked just as it had before the fire. It looked as if nothing had changed at all. Her breath caught in her throat, and she turned to Grace, her voice trembling. What is this? Why?" Grace smiled, her eyes full of love and something else, something like relief. "It's yours, Mom. It's always been yours. We just wanted you to come home." Evelyn blinked in disbelief. Her knees nearly buckled beneath her as the weight of the moment hit her. She wasn't being sent away. She was coming home. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes as she stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hardly believe it. The house, her sanctuary, had been brought back to life. And now, she had a chance to start over, to reclaim what was once lost. "You didn't," she started, her voice catching. Grace squeezed her hand. "We didn't want you to leave. We wanted you to stay with us, at home." For the first time in what felt like years, Evelyn allowed herself to hope. This wasn't an ending. It was a new beginning. The door to the house creaked open, and Evelyn stepped inside. She had not set foot here in what felt like forever, not since the fire had claimed everything she held dear. Yet now, as she stood in the entrance hall, it was as if time had reversed itself. The scent of freshly polished wood filled the air, mingling with the faint smell of paint. The floors were gleaming, the walls pristine, and the memories seemed to come rushing back all at once. It was a place she thought she'd lost forever. Sophia's laughter echoing through the rooms, their quiet evenings spent sitting by the fire, the way the light slanted through the windows in the late afternoon. All of it had been wiped away in a single tragic moment. Or so she thought. But here she was, standing in the doorway, staring at the home she had once shared with Sophia, the home where she had raised Grace, where life had been full of love and purpose. It was more than just a house. It was a part of her. And now it was back. Grace stood beside her, her eyes bright with emotion. "We had it rebuilt just for you, Mom. We wanted you to come back. This is where you belong." Evelyn looked around the room, her heart swelling in her chest. She didn't know what to say. Words didn't seem enough to convey the depth of her gratitude, the flood of emotion that had been locked away for so long. And then, as if the house itself was welcoming her back, the memories began to rush in. She saw Sophia in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. She saw Grace, a little girl, running down the hall, her laughter filling the house with joy. She saw the two of them, sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, their hands intertwined as they spoke of the future. For a moment, Evelyn closed her eyes, allowing herself to relive those precious memories, to feel the warmth of her past embrace her once more. Then, something else caught her attention, a soft sound, almost like a whisper. She turned, and there, in the back of the yard, was Lucky, her horse, the one she had loved more than anything else, the one that had been a part of her life for decades. He stood in the pasture, his coat glistening in the fading sunlight. Evelyn gasped. Lucky! She didn't know how it was possible, but there he was, alive and well. She could see the familiar twinkle in his eyes, the way he lifted his head as if he recognized her. Tears sprang to Evelyn's eyes as she hurried toward him, her heart racing. The years of longing, of missing him, flooded back in an instant. She hadn't seen Lucky since the fire, hadn't known what happened to him, but here he was, waiting for her, as if nothing had changed. As Evelyn reached the fence, Lucky trotted over, his hooves soft against the earth. She reached out and stroked his mane, feeling the familiar warmth beneath her fingers. She couldn't believe it. It felt like a dream. Grace and James appeared behind her, watching with smiles of their own. Grace stepped forward. "We thought you'd want to see him. We made sure he was taken care of after everything happened. He's been waiting for you, too." Evelyn looked at her daughter, her voice trembling. "You did all this? For me?" Grace nodded. "We knew how much you loved this place, Mom, and we knew it was time for you to come home. For both of you." Evelyn's heart swelled with emotion as she reached out to give Grace a tight hug. "I don't know how to thank you. You've given me everything, more than I ever expected." Grace held her tightly. "You don't need to thank me. This is where you belong." As they stood there, the sun dipping below the horizon, Evelyn knew that this was more than just a house, more than just the restoration of the past. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a second chance to rebuild her life, to find joy again, and to embrace the love and family that had always been there for her. Lucky nuzzled her, as if reminding her that no matter how much time had passed, some things remained constant, some bonds were unbreakable, and this place, this home, was a part of her soul. "Thank you," Evelyn whispered to the horse, to the house, to her daughter, to the memory of Sophia. "Thank you for bringing me back." The days that followed were a blur of emotions for Evelyn. It felt almost surreal, waking up each morning to the familiar creak of the wooden floors beneath her feet, the scent of coffee brewing in the kitchen, and the soft sounds of birds singing outside her window. She had not realized how much she missed this peace, this sense of belonging, until she found herself surrounded by it once more. She spent her mornings slowly reacquainting herself with the house, walking through the rooms she had once known so well, now restored to their former glory. The kitchen, which had once been the heart of the home, was the first place she ventured to each day. She ran her fingers over the countertops, as if searching for traces of the memories that still lingered there. The shelves were filled with the same old china, the ones she and Sophia had picked out together, setting the table for countless family dinners. It was as if Sophia had never left. But as the days wore on, Evelyn realized that it wasn't just the house that had changed, it was her. She felt lighter, more at peace, as if the weight of the years had finally lifted from her shoulders. Being back here, surrounded by memories, allowed her to reconnect with a part of herself she had lost. The fire that had taken so much from her had also robbed her of her sense of self, of her purpose. Now, though, the flame of that purpose was rekindled. Grace, too, was adjusting to the new dynamic. She had always been a doting daughter, but there was a new tenderness between them now, as if their relationship had deepened in a way that could only come with time and understanding. One afternoon, as Evelyn sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the world go by, Grace joined her. She was holding a notebook, and Evelyn raised an eyebrow, curious. "What's that?" Evelyn asked, her voice soft. Grace smiled and sat down beside her. "Just some notes for work. But I've been thinking, maybe we could do something together. Something just for you. What do you think?" Evelyn smiled, taking a sip of her tea. "I think that sounds wonderful. But what did you have in mind?" Grace hesitated, glancing at the notebook. "I thought maybe you could help me with the garden. I know you used to love planting flowers with Sophia. Maybe we can start there, just the two of us, making it our space. What do you think?" Evelyn's heart warmed at the idea. The garden had always been a special place for her and Sophia. They had spent hours tending to it, planting flowers and vegetables, dreaming of the life they would continue to build together. After Sophia's death, the garden had become a place of sorrow for Evelyn, a place where the memories were too painful to revisit. But now, with Grace's suggestion, it felt like an invitation to heal. "I think it's a perfect idea," Evelyn replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Let's make it our garden." And so, they began. Each afternoon, Grace and Evelyn worked side by side, planting new flowers, tending to the soil, and rebuilding what had once been a sanctuary of love and growth. The garden began to take shape, slowly but surely, as they shared stories of Sophia, of their life together, and of the future they were creating. It wasn't just about the flowers. It was about the bond between mother and daughter, the shared memories, and the hope of new beginnings. As they worked, Evelyn found herself filled with a sense of purpose she had long thought lost. She remembered the joy of watching things grow, of nurturing life, and it filled her with a quiet satisfaction. For the first time in a long while, Evelyn felt at peace. The garden had become Evelyn's refuge, a place where she could escape the noise of the world and reconnect with her past. The flowers they planted grew steadily, their colors a vibrant testament to the new life Evelyn was building. But it was more than just the flowers that filled her heart with joy. It was the time she spent with Grace, the quiet moments of shared memories and unspoken understanding. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Evelyn found herself alone in the garden, sitting on the old wooden bench that had once belonged to Sophia. The golden light bathed the flowers in a warm glow, and the faint scent of lavender hung in the air. It was a peaceful moment, but one that stirred a flood of memories. She closed her eyes, letting the memories of Sophia wash over her. The sound of her laughter, the way her hand felt in Evelyn's, the way they used to sit together in this very spot, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Evelyn had always found comfort in those quiet moments, when words weren't necessary. But those moments felt like a lifetime ago. Evelyn took a deep breath, her heart aching with a familiar emptiness. She missed Sophia. The longing for her was a constant companion, one that didn't seem to fade no matter how much time passed. "Mom." The sound of Grace's voice pulled Evelyn from her thoughts, and she opened her eyes to see her daughter standing at the edge of the garden, holding a basket of freshly picked flowers. Grace smiled softly and walked toward her, sitting down beside her on the bench. She placed the basket between them, the flowers a mix of bright colors, sunflowers, daisies, and roses. "Thought you might like these," Grace said, her voice tender. Evelyn smiled faintly, picking up one of the roses and inhaling its sweet fragrance. "They're beautiful. Thank you." For a moment, the two sat in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air. Grace had always been the strong one, the one who held everything together. But in this quiet moment, Evelyn saw a softness in her daughter's eyes, a vulnerability that reminded her of the bond they shared. "I was thinking," Grace began, her voice a little hesitant, "maybe it's time to finally finish what we started here, to turn this place into something that feels like home again. For both of us." Evelyn's heart swelled with emotion. She had always loved this house, but now it was more than just a place. It was a symbol of everything she had fought for, everything she had lost, and everything she had to look forward to. "I think you're right," Evelyn said quietly, "but we'll need a little more than just flowers." Grace laughed softly, the sound filling the air like music. "I was hoping you'd say that. I have a few ideas." And with that, they began to plan. Together, they would create a space that honored the past while welcoming the future. A garden that reflected the love and strength they shared, and the memory of the woman who had once tended it with so much care. As the evening wore on, Evelyn found herself reflecting on her journey. The fire that had nearly destroyed her, the heartbreak of losing Sophia, and the decision to leave the life she had known. It hadn't been easy, but each step she had taken had brought her closer to the woman she was becoming. It was a journey of rediscovery, and now, with Grace by her side, Evelyn could finally see the future, not as a place of fear, but as a place of possibility. As the stars began to twinkle above them, Evelyn turned to Grace, a sense of peace settling over her. "You know," Evelyn said, her voice gentle, "I think Sophia would have loved to see this." Grace nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I think she would have too. And I think she's still here in the garden, in all of us." Evelyn reached out and took her daughter's hand, squeezing it softly. "Thank you for bringing me home, Grace. I needed this more than you know." Grace smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "You don't have to thank me, Mom. This was always your home." And in that moment, Evelyn realized that Grace was right. Home wasn't just a place. It was a feeling of love, of family, and of the memories that kept us grounded, even when everything else felt uncertain. This was home. Evelyn awoke the next morning to the sound of birds singing outside her window. The sun was peeking through the curtains, casting soft beams of light across the room. For the first time in months, she didn't feel the heavy weight of uncertainty pressing on her chest. The house was quiet, save for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of the wind outside. It was a peaceful morning, one that promised new beginnings. As she sat up, her eyes fell on the photograph of Sophia that she kept on the nightstand. It was a black and white picture taken years ago, the two of them standing together in the garden, smiling at the camera as if the world outside didn't exist. Evelyn had always loved that photo. It captured a time of simplicity before the storm of loss had swept in. Today, as she gazed at it, Evelyn felt a sense of calm she hadn't known in years. Sophia's spirit still lingered in the house, in the garden, in the very air that Evelyn breathed. It was as if her partner's love had never truly left, only transformed, becoming part of the foundation of this home. Downstairs, the smell of fresh coffee drifted into the living room, drawing Evelyn toward the kitchen. She found Grace already there, pouring coffee into 2 mugs, her face lighting up when she saw Evelyn. "Good morning, Mom," Grace said, her voice warm and full of life. "How'd you sleep?" Evelyn smiled, walking over to the counter where Grace had set out the mugs. "Better than I have in a long time. I think I'm starting to feel like myself again." Grace reached for the sugar and cream, placing them on the counter. "I'm so glad to hear that. We've come a long way, haven't we?" Evelyn took the mug that Grace offered her, letting the warmth of the coffee seep into her hands. She nodded, taking a sip. The rich, bold flavor tasted like the promise of a new chapter. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said yesterday," Evelyn said quietly, her voice thoughtful. "About finishing what we started here in the garden." Grace's eyes brightened. "I meant it, Mom. We've worked so hard to get to this point. It's time to make this place ours again." Evelyn set the mug down on the counter and looked out the window, where the garden stretched before her. She could see the flowers they'd planted together, already beginning to bloom. It wasn't just a garden. It was a symbol of their resilience, their commitment to each other. Each flower that blossomed was a reminder of the love they had for this place and for each other. "I know what I want to do next," Evelyn said suddenly, her voice clear and strong. "I want to restore the old barn. The one Sophia and I used to spend so much time in. It's been years since it's seen any use, but I think it's time." Grace looked surprised but intrigued. "Are you sure? That barn's been through a lot." "I know," Evelyn said with a smile, "but it's part of who I am, part of who we are, and I think we could do something beautiful with it. Maybe we could turn it into a space where people could come and share stories about love, loss, and the beauty of finding your way home." Grace's eyes softened with emotion. "That sounds like a wonderful idea, Mom. I think Sophia would be proud." Evelyn's heart swelled at the mention of Sophia's name. She always believed in turning the broken things into something better. "I think that's what we've done here." Together, they spent the rest of the morning making plans for the barn. It was going to take a lot of work, but Evelyn felt more alive than she had in years. There was something healing about envisioning a future filled with hope and purpose, about honoring the past while embracing the promise of what was to come. Later that afternoon, Evelyn took a walk down the familiar path that led to the barn. She hadn't been here in years, but the memories came rushing back. The sound of the horses' hooves on the floorboards, the laughter of friends and family gathered for picnics and celebrations. When she reached the barn door, Evelyn hesitated for just a moment, the weight of memories threatening to overwhelm her. But then she pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges like the sigh of a long-forgotten secret. Inside, the barn was dusty and worn, but it still held its old charm. The light from the afternoon sun streamed through the gaps in the walls, casting rays of golden light across the wooden beams. It was in this space that Evelyn had built so many memories, and now, it was where she would build new ones. As she stood there, taking it all in, the sound of hooves in the distance reached her ears. Her heart skipped a beat. Lucky. She turned to find the familiar shape of her beloved horse emerging from the field. The sight of him brought a rush of warmth to her chest, and she felt a tear slip down her cheek. Evelyn walked toward him, her hand outstretched. When Lucky nuzzled her, she felt a deep connection, one that transcended time and loss. He was a reminder of her past, of the life she had built with Sophia. And now, he was part of this new chapter. Grace appeared at the entrance of the barn, watching with a soft smile on her face. "I think Lucky missed you, Mom." Evelyn looked up at her daughter, her heart full. "I missed him too." Together, mother and daughter stood in the barn, side by side, the past and present woven into the fabric of the place. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other, and that was enough. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Evelyn and Grace spent their mornings working on the barn, cleaning out the old tools and debris that had accumulated over the years. Grace's husband, James, pitched in whenever he could, though his work kept him busy. Still, he was supportive, always bringing over supplies or lending a hand when needed. But it wasn't just the physical work that kept them busy. It was the emotional healing that came with every brushstroke of paint, every nail hammered into place. Evelyn felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years, as though the barn was becoming a living extension of herself, a place where the past and future could coexist. One afternoon, while Grace was inside sorting through the old furniture they planned to restore, Evelyn decided to take a break. She went outside to the garden, where the flowers were blooming in a riot of color. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and roses, and she could hear the soft hum of bees moving from flower to flower. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun wash over her. She thought of Sophia, as she often did, and how she would have loved to see this moment. The house coming back to life, the barn slowly being transformed, and the garden thriving. She wished Sophia were here, to share it with her, but she knew that her partner's spirit was present in the very soil beneath her feet. As she stood there, lost in thought, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. She turned to see Grace walking toward her, her face lit up with excitement. "Mom, you've got to see this," Grace said, her eyes shining. "The barn's starting to come together." We're going to be able to open it up for that first community event we talked about soon. Evelyn smiled, following her daughter back to the barn. The work was far from finished, but there was a new energy in the air, one that spoke of hope, of new beginnings. Inside the barn, James had set up some old chairs they'd found in the attic, and the floors were being swept and polished. It was beginning to look like a place that could hold the kind of memories Evelyn had dreamed of creating again. A place to gather, to share stories, to laugh, and to heal. "I've been thinking about what you said, Grace," Evelyn said, her voice thoughtful, "about turning this place into a community space. I think we should do something special for the grand opening, a kind of celebration of the past and what this place means to us." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Evelyn's face softened, her heart full of emotion. "We could invite people from the old neighborhood, some of the folks we used to know. I want them to see what we've done here. And maybe we could honor Sophia's memory, too. Have a small ceremony for her, nothing fancy, but something that feels right." Grace nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I think that sounds perfect, Mom. It'll be a way for everyone to see the heart of what we're doing here." Evelyn looked around the barn, her eyes sweeping over the work they had already done. There was so much more to go, but she felt a sense of pride welling up inside her. This place, this home, was becoming a symbol of what she had always believed in: love, resilience, and the importance of family. That evening, as they all sat down for dinner in the kitchen, Evelyn raised her glass in a quiet toast. "To new beginnings," she said softly. "To new beginnings," Grace and James echoed, clinking their glasses together. Evelyn felt the warmth of those words sink into her soul. She had spent so many years feeling lost and alone, unsure of where she belonged. But now, with Grace and James by her side, she knew that home wasn't just a place. It was the people she shared it with. Later that night, after the dishes were cleaned and the house was quiet, Evelyn stood by the window looking out at the barn. The moonlight cast long shadows over the yard, and she could hear the rustling of leaves in the trees. Lucky was grazing in the field, content and at peace, and for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt the same way. She wasn't just looking at the barn. She was looking at her future. It was a future that honored the past, a future built on love and the memories that would never fade. With Grace and James by her side, she knew there was so much more ahead. The days leading up to the grand opening of the barn flew by in a flurry of activity. Grace and Evelyn worked tirelessly, planning the details of the event, inviting old friends and neighbors, and making sure every last detail was perfect. James continued to lend his support, often staying late into the night to help set up lighting and sound systems, while also managing his own work commitments. As the morning of the event dawned, the air was filled with anticipation and a touch of nervousness. Evelyn stood in the yard, looking at the barn she and Grace had brought back to life. It was a sight to behold, freshly painted, with new windows and a clean, welcoming look. The lawn around it was neatly mowed, and the flowers she and Grace had planted were in full bloom, adding vibrant splashes of color to the landscape. Inside the barn, the transformation was just as remarkable. Old wooden beams had been restored, the floors polished to a gleaming finish, and rows of chairs set up for guests. The smell of fresh flowers and candles filled the air, and Evelyn couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. This place wasn't just a barn anymore. It was a sanctuary, a place where memories would be made, where stories would be shared, and where the past would blend seamlessly with the future. Grace was bustling around, checking last-minute details, while James stood by, offering quiet support. Miss Collette arrived early, as usual, carrying a casserole dish and a warm smile. She had become a regular fixture in Evelyn's life, a source of comfort and a reminder that even when life seemed darkest, there were still rays of sunshine to be found. "Everything looks perfect, Evelyn," Miss Collette said, giving her a reassuring pat on the back. "You've really outdone yourselves." Evelyn smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Miss Collette. I couldn't have done it without Grace and James. They've been amazing." As guests began to arrive, the barn quickly filled with laughter and the buzz of excited conversations. Old friends greeted each other warmly, some tears of joy mingling with the laughter. It was a reunion of sorts, a gathering of people who had known Evelyn and Grace for years, who had watched them grow and change, and who now saw the results of their hard work. Evelyn stood at the entrance, her heart pounding with a mix of pride and anticipation. She watched as people she hadn't seen in ages walked through the doors, their faces lighting up with recognition and surprise. Some even shed tears, overwhelmed by the transformation of the old, dilapidated barn into a beautiful, functional space. "This place looks incredible, Evelyn," one of her old neighbors, Mrs. Martin, said, taking her hand. "You and Grace have really done a fantastic job." Evelyn nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you. It's been a lot of hard work, but it's worth it." As the event got underway, Grace took the microphone and welcomed everyone, thanking them for coming and explaining the vision behind the barn. She spoke of how it wasn't just a place to store hay or tools. It was a community hub, a place where people could come together, share their stories, and support one another. "Today is about celebrating not just this barn, but the people who fill it with life," Grace said, her voice catching with emotion. "This barn is a symbol of new beginnings, of hope, and of the power of community." James stepped up next, his voice warm and encouraging. He spoke about the importance of family, of standing by one another through thick and thin, and how the barn was a testament to the strength of the Harper family. "And let's not forget Lucky," James added, smiling as he gestured to the horse grazing contentedly outside the barn. "Evelyn's cherished companion and a symbol of the love and memories we hold dear." Evelyn felt a lump in her throat as she listened to their words. This day was more than just a grand opening. It was a celebration of life, love, and the enduring power of family. It was a reminder that even when things seemed impossible, hope and new beginnings were always within reach. After the speeches, they all enjoyed a meal together, with Miss Collette's casserole a clear favorite. Stories were shared, laughter echoed through the barn, and old photographs circulated as people reminisced about days gone by. Evelyn felt a deep sense of gratitude for this moment, for the people who had come to celebrate with her, and for the new life she was beginning to build. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden light over the barn, Evelyn stood at the back, watching as her vision came to life. The barn was filled with joy and laughter, and she knew she had finally found her place, a place where she truly belonged. "We did it, Grace," Evelyn whispered, her voice full of emotion. "We really did it." Grace took her mother's hand, squeezing it tightly. "We sure did, Mom, and we're just getting started." Evelyn smiled, tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked around at the people she loved, the friends who had come to support her, and she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. This was her home, her future, and she was exactly where she was meant to be. The weeks following the grand opening of the barn were filled with a steady rhythm of life that Evelyn had longed for. Every morning, she woke up early to tend to the garden she had started outside the barn. There was something deeply satisfying about working the soil, watching the flowers and vegetables grow, and feeling connected to the earth beneath her hands. It was a quiet, grounding routine that had become as familiar as breathing. Grace continued to balance her family and work life, but there was a noticeable shift in her demeanor. The stress that once clung to her shoulders seemed to lift, replaced by a calm sense of contentment. James was thriving as well, though his work at the barn had slowed down. Now, he often found himself helping the community with projects or working on his own small woodworking projects in the evenings. Miss Collette had become a regular visitor at the barn. She often brought over baked goods or fresh produce from her garden and always had a new story to tell. Her humor and blunt observations added a lightness to the everyday life of the Harper family. It was impossible not to laugh when she was around, and Evelyn found that those moments of joy had become an essential part of her days. One afternoon, as Evelyn was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the children play in the yard, Grace came outside with a look of quiet determination. "Mom, I think it's time," Grace said, her voice tinged with excitement. "Time for what?" Evelyn asked, raising an eyebrow. "For you to start something new," Grace said, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "I've been talking to James, and we think you should teach a class. You've always had a talent for painting, and the barn is the perfect place for it. We can host painting workshops for the community, something creative, something fun." Evelyn was taken aback by the suggestion, But as she thought about it, a warm sense of excitement began to stir inside her. She hadn't painted in years, but she remembered how it used to bring her joy, how she used to lose herself in the strokes of the brush, creating worlds on the canvas. It had been a long time since she'd felt that kind of freedom. "You really think people would want to take a painting class?" Evelyn asked, a hint of doubt creeping into her voice. "I know they would," Grace replied confidently. "You have so much to offer, Mom. Your talent, your heart, people will be drawn to it. I've already talked to a few people, and they're excited. Plus, we'll be able to create something meaningful here. In this space we've worked so hard to restore." Evelyn's gaze drifted over to the barn, the place that had come to represent so much of what she had reclaimed in her life: hope, purpose, and community. She could see it now, the walls lined with art, the sound of brushes on canvas mingling with laughter and conversation. It felt right, like the next step in her journey. "I'll do it," Evelyn said, a smile spreading across her face. "Let's see where it takes us." As word spread about Evelyn's new painting workshops, the response was overwhelming. People from all over town came to sign up, eager to learn from the woman who had breathed new life into the barn. Evelyn's first class was a mix of excitement and nerves, but once she picked up her paintbrush and began to guide the group, everything fell into place. Her confidence grew with every stroke, and soon, the room was filled with the hum of creativity. The classes became more than just an artistic endeavor. They became a gathering place for people to share stories, to learn not just about painting, but about each other. Evelyn found herself not just teaching art, but also offering a listening ear, a source of wisdom, and a reminder that it's never too late to start something new. Through it all, Evelyn found herself rediscovering parts of her past, pieces of herself that had been buried beneath the weight of her fears and doubts. She remembered the dreams she had once held, the joy of creating, and the connections she had formed through art. And slowly, she began to see that the barn wasn't just a place to heal. It was a place where new dreams could be born. Grace, who had always been supportive but distant at times, became more involved in the workshops. She helped organize the classes, encouraged others to join, and was proud to see her mother come alive in a way she hadn't in years. Watching Evelyn thrive brought Grace an unexpected sense of peace, knowing that her mother was no longer just existing, but living fully again. Miss Collette often stopped by to lend a hand with preparations, offering her candid advice on everything from scheduling to how to best manage the group of eager students. She had taken to calling herself Evelyn's artistic assistant, though no one could be quite sure what her qualifications were beyond her love for the community and her undeniable flair for humor. The workshops were a success, and as the months passed, Evelyn's reputation as an artist grew. The barn became known not just for its transformation, but for the sense of belonging it fostered. It was no longer just a building. It was a symbol of what could be accomplished when you believed in yourself, when you trusted the people who loved you, and when you were willing to take a leap of faith into the unknown. And for Evelyn, it was the beginning of something new, a life filled with creativity, connection, and the unwavering love of her family. The months continued to unfold gently, and Evelyn found herself surrounded by the fruits of her labor. The barn had become a hub of activity, workshops, gatherings, and even small art exhibitions showcasing her students' work. But it wasn't just the tangible success that brought Evelyn peace. It was the quieter moments, the ones when she sat in the barn after the last class of the day, the setting sun casting long shadows across the wooden beams, and she could hear the faint sounds of the outside world, birds calling, wind rustling through the trees, the soft hum of the countryside. She had found something she hadn't realized she was missing: contentment. The kind of peace that doesn't come from accomplishments or validation, but from being fully present in the life she had created. The barn was more than just a building. It had become a place where her own journey of healing and rediscovery had blossomed, and she had nurtured that growth every single day. One evening, as the autumn leaves turned amber and gold, Grace and James surprised Evelyn with a small, intimate gathering. There was no fanfare, just the quiet hum of laughter and the warm glow of candles scattered around the barn. The people who had become a part of Evelyn's world, her students, Ms. Collette, and the few close friends who had stayed with her through the years, had all come together to celebrate. As the evening wore on, Grace stood up, a glass of wine in hand. "Mom, I just want to say something," she said, her voice steady, but carrying an emotion that only a daughter could feel for her mother. "You've taught me so much about strength, about resilience, and most of all, about love. I've watched you transform in ways I didn't think possible, and I want you to know how incredibly proud I am of you." Evelyn's heart swelled with pride, but there was no need for words. She reached out for Grace's hand, squeezing it gently, a silent acknowledgement of all they had shared and all they had built together. "This moment, this family, this was everything," James added with a playful grin. "And I think we're all excited about the possibility of the barn becoming a permanent fixture of this town. It's not just a barn anymore. It's a part of all of us." Evelyn felt a knot of emotion rise in her chest. This was her home, not just the barn, but the life she had found here. The people who had come into her life, who had given her space to heal, to grow, to begin again. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. As the evening drew to a close, Miss Collette made her usual rounds, chatting with everyone and offering her distinct brand of advice. But this time, she pulled Evelyn aside, her eyes twinkling. "You know, Evelyn," she said, "I may have been blunt at times, but I've always known you had it in you. You were never meant to be in a nursing home or shuffled around like an old forgotten object. You were meant to live, to create, to be with people who love you. And you've done all of that, my dear." Evelyn laughed softly, a sense of gratitude flooding her heart. "Thank you, Colette," she said, her voice soft but full of meaning. "I didn't know it at the time, but you were right. This was where I was supposed to be all along." The night ended quietly, with the last few guests slipping away into the cool night air. Evelyn stood at the doorway of the barn, looking out at the horizon, the stars just beginning to twinkle above. She thought of Sophia, of the life they had shared, and how that love still lingered in the corners of her heart. Sophia's spirit was always with her, not as a shadow, but as a guiding light, encouraging her to keep moving forward, to keep living fully. It had taken time. Time to heal, to accept change, and to understand that love wasn't just something that happened in the past. It was something that could be carried forward, even into the unknown. Evelyn Harper had come full circle. She had started this journey believing she was a burden to her daughter, that she had nothing more to offer. But now, she stood in the light of a new chapter, knowing that love, like the barn, could always be rebuilt. And in doing so, it could create something more beautiful than she ever imagined. The days that followed the gathering in the barn were peaceful, but they were also filled with small, significant moments. Evelyn had finally made her peace with the idea that her life could be different now, that it could be a life full of possibilities rather than endings. She spent her mornings tending to the garden she'd started outside the barn, watching as the flowers and vegetables she'd planted took root and flourished. She reveled in the quiet joy of doing things she never thought she'd have the time for again. Painting, reading, and even taking long walks with Lucky, her horse, whose steady presence had always been a reminder of simpler times. One particularly crisp morning, as she stood outside, her gaze resting on the barn, Evelyn felt a deep sense of belonging. The barn had been restored not just for her, but because it was a place that symbolized the possibility of new beginnings. It had become a sanctuary for the creative spirit, for healing, for reconnection with the past, and a bridge to the future. And it was all hers. As the winter months began to settle in, bringing with them the quiet stillness of the season, Grace and James made their way out to the farm more often. The connection between mother and daughter had deepened in a way Evelyn had never expected. It was a bond strengthened by time and shared experience, but also by the understanding that, no matter what, they would always be there for each other. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, the three of them enjoying a quiet meal, Grace reached across the table and gently took her mother's hand. "I don't think I've ever truly said this before, Mom," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "But I'm so glad we did this. I'm glad you stayed." Evelyn smiled, her heart full. "I think I am too," she said quietly. "For a long time, I thought I was too old for change. But now, I see that change isn't about age. It's about where you're willing to place your heart. The weight of her words hung in the air, and for a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the crackling fire and the soft hum of contentment. Evelyn had found a new rhythm, a new way of living that filled her with purpose. And it was clear to her now that this was the life she was meant to live. A life where love didn't simply survive, but thrived. Months passed, and soon it was spring once more. The garden outside the barn bloomed into a riot of colors, and Evelyn found herself planting new seeds, both literally and figuratively. With Grace's support, she had begun teaching art classes to children from the local town, passing on the knowledge and creativity she had so carefully cultivated over the years. It was one afternoon in late spring that Evelyn sat on the porch, watching as the students left for the day, their faces lit up with excitement after a lesson filled with color and imagination. Grace joined her, sitting beside her mother with a warm smile. "I think they really love coming here," Grace said, her eyes shining. "And I think you've given them something they'll remember for the rest of their lives." Evelyn nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction she hadn't expected. She looked at the barn, at the life she had built, and at her daughter beside her. This place, this home, was the manifestation of everything she had ever wanted, even if she hadn't known it at the time. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the fields, Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, letting the peace of the evening wash over her. The barn, the garden, the animals, and most of all, her family. These were the things that made her feel alive. She had not just survived. She had flourished. And as she thought of Sophia, her late partner, who had been the love of her life and the one who had always believed in her, Evelyn felt the presence of her spirit, soft, gentle, and eternal, reminding her that love, in all its forms, was what made a home truly home. Evelyn Harper was no longer searching for a place to belong. She had found it, right where she had always been. What does home mean to you? Have you ever had to rebuild or redefine your place in the world? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of transformation, love, and second chances.